I don't know, more normalization of things that are now kind of edgy on the internet, as they tend to be. They're going to slide into mainstream culture, and they're going to take different other forms while they're being kind of co-opted into existing narratives. So yeah, it's an interesting time to be on the internet.
I'm Miriam Hoffman, a full-time college student living in Carbondale, Illinois, and you're listening to the Vance Crow Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today, we have a returning guest, Alex Kaschuta. Last time we talked to Alex, she was just getting her podcast started. Her podcast is called Subversive, and it is just that. Every single one of her guests has an opinion or a perspective on the world that you may not agree with. In fact, you probably won't even like all of what they have to say. But oftentimes they are pushing the very edges of what social discourse is supposed to be about. And I find it to be fascinating because many of the things that I encounter there, I think at first, these are repellent ideas, or these are things that I don't even want to engage with. But over time, you start realizing, wait, we're not allowed to talk about those things, or maybe this is something that we should explore further. So I am really excited to have Alex Kaschuta on. If you are a longtime listener to the podcast, you know that we have the Articulate Ventures Network. This is a group of people that love the podcast, and they wanted to have a place where they could get together and discuss it with other people that were also interested in the podcast. But it has grown to be so much more than just that. Now we hold speaking gyms where people can practice speeches that they have upcoming or get better at being able to do things like introduce themselves or give a toast. And we also do things like movie nights and book clubs and a circular firing squad where we pick intentionally controversial subjects and have the group get together and take different perspectives and try and argue and discuss these ideas. So that way we can push on the frame of what we know, only to learn more and to be exposed to different ideas to make us broader, more interesting people. So if you are enjoying this conversation with Alex Kaschuta, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. You can do that by going to network.articulate.ventures. All right, without further ado, let's head to an interview with my friend, Alex Kaschuta. Alex Kaschuta, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me back, Vance.
Well, longtime listeners of the podcast know that you live in Romania, which isn't that far from the Ukrainian-Russia conflict. So what is it like in the world where you are right now?
Yeah, it's surprisingly probably not that different from Missouri or anywhere in the U.S. It's just enough distance to be permanently scared, but also not enough to actually see any sort of conflict or difference on the street or interacting with people here. There's always kind of the Russian menace is a thing here. People are not necessarily friendly towards Russia. There's a constant threat in the air, and people, like my family, we have a lot of horror stories about the Red Army. Kind of historically, a lot of family lore is quite negative towards the Russians, but that's something to be expected when you live at the edge of an empire who's had claims on the territories around us, or at least in the sphere of influence, because Romania was not part of the Soviet Union proper, was never part of Russia proper, but we have had dealings with the Russians many times in our history. So I would say probably a bit apprehensive, a bit scared, bombarded by a lot of information. More so from the Ukrainian side, because that seems to be the biggest chunk of information that exists online. And there's definitely a line that needs to be towed in terms of what one should think about the conflict. So I would say it's probably very similar to what you hear in the West anywhere. Essentially, we're getting the same social media, we're getting the same Reuters, AP, the same people are talking to us. If you're not on the ground in Ukraine, and even there, you would have a very myopic perspective of what's going on locally. It's very, very hard to get to grips of what actually is happening, who's attacking who. It's just the fog of war is thick. So yeah, I'm probably not much wiser than anyone else at this point.
Well, I think what you're describing is the exact thing that I'm feeling. And it's funny about the fog of war, because when you're in the fog of war, it doesn't feel like it, right? It feels like, oh, I've got a crystal clear view of everything that's going on. And for people that don't know, you run a podcast called Subversive, which really goes to find perspectives that run against the grain. And I have found, while trying to discover what's really going on between Russia and the Ukraine, like you said, there's a very myopic point of view, and there is a line that you have to toe here, because to not do it means that you're somehow a traitor. Out
Yeah.
in the world, what are you hearing are the kind of counter perspectives than the mainstream one that we've heard about what's going on in Russia, or what their intents are?
I mean, the main counter perspective is that I don't think anyone's saying that very few people are on the side of Russia who are not actual Russians and or interested in some imperial project tied to Russia. A lot of people, I mean, most people see this as an act of aggression. That being said, the people who tend to be more disagreeable about this tend to not be surprised by this. So they tend to have expected the war. They tend to have seen an encroachment of NATO in 5 successive waves since the 1990s, since an expansion of NATO was promised under Helmut Kohl. That NATO would stick to East Germany. Well, those days are past. NATO is now and has been at the door of Russia for a long time, and as far as people in Russia, like for example, I've had Anatoly Karlin on the show. He's probably more pro-Russia than most people, but this is the Subversive podcast, and I do that's my purpose to platform these people. Um, his perspective is obviously more. He's someone who's lived in the West, moved back to Russia because he has he has a Russian soul. He's Russian. He identifies with Russia, and he essentially his idea was okay. The West gave him as much as he could as he wanted, and it was time to move back to Russia. So he has a very different perspective from what you'll hear in the mainstream, and what he's laid out is not necessarily a justification for the act of aggression. It was more of okay, is Putin insane? He does not think that Putin is insane. He has a coherent worldview that he laid out in different speeches. That's evolved throughout the years. He used to be more of a technocratic perspective about 15, 20 years ago, and now he's slowly moved into a more kind of a multipolar and Russian nationalism perspective that has different characteristics. Like for example, it's not ethno nationalist. It's a civic nationalism of the Russian of kind of the Russian soul, where there's kind of a Russian core, but there's a multi-ethnic society built around the Russian perspective. So there are a lot of people talking about this. For example, there's also Samo Buria. He also has a kind of a more contrarian perspective on this. It's very easy to be contrarian about this if you have any sort of perspective outside of no fly zone now, and we need to I don't know um, start regime change in Russia or things like that. That's kind of that's pretty much what you're expected to say. Sama also has a perspective that's a little bit off the beaten path, just because he also understands why this happened, or he says okay, this is Russia does see NATO expansion as an act of aggression. I mean, you can ask yourself the question, okay, could Russia join NATO? Russia could not join NATO because NATO is essentially an anti-Russia coalition, which has been slowly inching closer to Russia, to the point where now there's the guns are at the door and they're closer and closer to the door. And there's also been a lot of involvement from the West. Like for example, a lot of people now tend to see Ukraine. Okay, this is a free society at the edge of Russia. The Russians don't like that. They want to I don't know, have territorial claims over the territory, and historical claims over it. There's a Russian population. Um, it's not just that. Like a country like Ukraine is very much either a vassal state of Russia, or it's a vassal state of a different. These areas between empires are very unstable. They're protectorates. Romania is a protectorate of the West now. We're in the European Union. Is this the best long term plan for Romania? It might be. It might also not be. I'm someone who's I'm documenting the decline of the West in many ways. So 50, 100 years from now, it might not be that our allegiances were the best bet. It's very hard to predict what's going to happen now. Like for example, if China allies with Russia, there's a lot of energy concerns. There's a lot of will the petrodollar collapse? There's a lot of things that are happening at the same time, and there's this context collapse that we're all supposed to be participating in, which is eerily similar to what happened with COVID. Because, for example, if you had concerns with lockdowns, if you had concerns with vaccine mandates, if you had concerns with all of these extremely strident measures, you were called a denier. You were called, a anti-vaxxer, like, complete slander for voicing very legitimate concerns. Which now, people are saying, oh, actually, yeah, it was pretty legitimate. Now it's okay to say that. But now we're seeing the same thing with the Russian war. It's like, okay, we can't have Russian sopranos because they need to be thrown out in the street. Like, don't teach Dostoevsky, Putin shill. Everyone's a Putin shill. Um, this is eerily similar, and the same people are pushing it. So obviously, my haunches are a little bit up with what's going on here because, yeah, I mean, like I said, I really don't have the complete picture. Like the fog of war is thicker than anyone can imagine, even here. So it's very hard to say. I wouldn't have a policy prescription for any country, even in this region. You kind of have to wait and see and piece together whatever you can from different perspectives, from different analysts, from different places, even people in Russia. Like crazy Anatoly Karlin. Yeah, maybe he's worth a listen.
I think that it was really difficult for me when all the stuff with COVID was going on. I was like, man, mobs are forming so fast here. But that was just one thing. And you might think, well, disease makes people do all kinds of crazy things. And then we watched the Canadian trucker convoy get blown into this, like, oh, these are traitors of their country. And you're like, okay, that doesn't seem right. But, maybe there's something I'm not getting here. And when the Ukraine Russia thing came out, and now suddenly people are so pro Ukrainian that you can't even bring up other ideas. It really, I think, was the most startling of all because it was the third time where there's no two ways about it. There is a straight line between what people want you to believe and where if you go over that line you're knocked out. And it really has been a very jarring experience for me. I find myself really saying, like, well, it took me to being in my 40s before I was knocked clear of all of my naivety about how much our narratives are controlled.
Yeah, and it feels to me like we're building up to an event. Like all of these, past narratives. If we look at past wars, like for example Syria, Libya, um, every one of these conflicts, Iraq, they had a red line event. And I feel like, obviously the US's position up until this point has been okay, there's not going to be a direct involvement. I mean, the sanctions are quite violent in themselves. They could be seen as an act of war, participating in funding armament, even through, third parties could be seen as an act of war, but no direct involvement, no boots on the ground for now. But there has always been this moment where, okay, oh, there's, what was it, chemical weapons in Syria, WMDs. There was, the Arab Spring. The people wanted it. All of these revolutions that were, very much tied into Western NGOs as well. There's, they're not called color revolutions for nothing. So there's a lot of like the casus belli for all of these things has been this little thing that happened, and now we have I think it's Bucha, the massacre, which is again one of these very foggy events. Apparently Russian soldiers just cold-bloodedly massacred 280 people in a village. Absolutely horrendous, footage, and there's the New York Times, was pumping out stories about this, and this feels like if it's not the red line event, it's being pushed to be something like that. There needs to be that moment. So my fear is that if it's not this, it's going to be something else. There's going to be some event, like the picture of the small boy washed up on the shore. Like there's going to be something that's extremely emotionally salient, extremely horrendous, obviously, and that also carries with it like an image that can be replicated and provided to everyone to convince them that, okay, the next step is no fly zone, which sounds awesome. It's just like, oh, we're just telling them to not fly. No, that's a declaration of war. You can't really stop people from flying without shooting them out of the air. There's no negotiation there. So there's a lot of emotional artillery that's being fired back and forth here, on both sides, obviously. But it seems that we're not really getting that much Russian propaganda, or maybe I am, because I'm the crazy person who's actually saying something that this might be, crazy two sides Alex. But something fishy is afoot. and I'm not going to let this, collapse my narrative if I can help it.
Amen. I mean, one of the things that scared me the most about actions that the United States has taken is when they've started okaying, giving the thumbs up to seizing property of people we're not at war with. And you see the general population celebrating this, like, hey, there was a Russian oligarch who we've never heard of, but you've told me is the second most important person in Russia. And so therefore, if we take his ill-gotten gains and we just, make them our possessions, this is okay. And there was at one point, I haven't followed up on it, where the US government was saying, yeah, well, we may end up bringing back this ability for you to essentially do piracy out on the high seas. You see one of these people that we've targeted, we've determined that they have property that you shouldn't have. You're able to go and take it and seize their property. This to me is so insane as to be one of the most dangerous acts you could take, because believe in almost no international law. I think there's no agreement that we make between states unless you sign a treaty that says very clearly what I agree to and what that other state agrees to. But there's one that we all have to agree to, and it's the basis of international law, which is pirates are the worst thing that you can have, and anyone that allows piracy is an enemy of ours. But we've now just instituted it. We've now just made that something that's okay. And once you let this out of the bag, now you are incentivizing people to make all sorts of bad actions and to frame things in ways like you were talking about that can get out of control so fast. And people are making decisions well before they know anything at all about what happened or why it happened.
Yeah, and it's essentially a permanent state of hysteria, a permanent state of emergency, which is a permanent state of, you know complete powers to whoever rules. Was this a planned? Is this like a cabal of people organizing this? I don't necessarily think so. Are people profiting from the nature of the technology that enables these things, like that enables the George Floyd video to circulate everywhere and enrage, a nation, that enables, pictures of a boy at the shores of the Mediterranean to, open the borders of the EU. This is stuff that people seize on, obviously, because it's possible, and it spreads like wildfire. You don't even have to seed it. These are emotionally salient images. They are often, more often than not, of actual horrors in the world, and they are politically important, and they drive policy and they drive everything. Like people collapsing on the streets of Wuhan. Remember that? That led to uh, healthy people, billions of people, healthy people getting locked down in quarantine. A new use of the word quarantine. Like this is all the outgrowth of this permanent state of emergency that we're put in. Believe me, next year we'll have something else, and there's going to be something
And
else.
that's the state of emergency. The Gelman amnesia effect, I think, is one of the most fascinating concepts, because what it says, I think, Alex, is if you're reading something in the New York Times about a subject you know a lot about, I'm in agriculture, right? I read it and I'm like, this author doesn't know anything. Yes, he's using a language I can understand, all the words are in sentences, but the concepts they are articulating are so off as to be, I would completely write this off. But then you turn the page and you get to a subject that you don't know anything about, and you're like, oh, that's interesting, look what they're doing in the Ukraine, or oh, look at how whatever, their water issues that are going on here. And this to me seems like a perfect example. The Wuhan thing, I'll never forget the day I stopped doing whatever I was doing and went upstairs and showed my wife the image of people pulling a dead body somewhere in Latin America. And then when the body fell out, they just ran away because they were so afraid of it. And it was like, look, we really do need to take this seriously. And I mean, now we've figured out, the government has figured out how to take that, weaponize it on a grand scale so that we're always in this hypertension about everything.
Yeah, it's someone on Twitter described it as do somethingism, and it was a really good explanation. Like extreme, extreme liberality in means extreme safetyism with extreme liberality in the means used to achieve that safetyism. So no expense spared, and it is essentially, like, for example, you could observe, like, let's say that all of the narratives are true about what's going on in Russia: complete act of aggression, surprise, attacking, out of the blue, a massacres, everything. um that what happens there and what we should do about it are two different things. People really can't see that. With COVID as well, serious disease, absolutely. Does it kill? It kills. It's worse than the flu, 10 times worse than the flu. What do we do about it is not instantly tied to the gravity of the situation. Like there's not there's no reason to instigate World War III, even if things are bad. There might be ways to de-escalate. There might be ways to offer a person an off-ramp, even if that guy is a bad guy. Whereas, like, there's no more realpolitik at all in permanent hysteria. It's all like, okay, who are the Jews and who are the Nazis in the situation? We need to know so that we can have the most insane response to them. So that we need to get rid of the soprano. We need to never speak the language again. We need to banish Voldemort from the scene. This is childish. This is childish, and we've reduced politics, health policy, things that are really important. Trade policy, energy policy, all of these things that really keep the lights on, literally keep food on the table, to child's play. Is this, like I said, is this directed from above? There might be an ingredient of that. Is this used by people? The fact that the media and the substrate that we have, the technology that we have, enables these mimetic waves to take hold and to be politically salient. Yes, people use these things and these phenomena. So it's
Yeah, and at the time when people are at some of their weakest moments, right? I don't know how it's going in Romania, but we are watching inflation go wild here, and
yes.
this is fundamentally the most important issue going on, which is how can you take the resources that you have and what will they be able to purchase in the future? How much is your work being stripped away, and the value of that? And this is not a robust discussion at all in the United States. Every once in a while it comes up, and then they say, oh, those dastardly Russians, look what they've done to the
Yeah.
price of our gas, when you don't realize, like, no, this is the price of your eggs, this is the price of your meat, which has almost nothing at all to do with Russia and the Ukraine. I mean, certainly you could tie some amount of a percent to it, but nothing on the scale of actual events that are going to impact people, not just for 5 years or 10 years, but potentially for generations.
Yeah, I mean, if we remember, this is exactly what happened with COVID. Like, oh, jobs were lost because of COVID. Lives were lost even in the hospitals because of COVID. It was essentially because of COVID measures. That's the little missing part that people didn't explain, because it's very hard to, be able to take responsibility for all the extreme things. People, it's easy to be, if this is the headline thing that we're all concerned about, the current thing, COVID, people who die of COVID obviously are important because they're tied to the current thing. People who die because they didn't get cancer treatment or dialysis, or didn't have a job, or just wasted away, went homeless, or things like that, not tied to COVID. Well, they are not that important. So it's one of those things that's the media magnifying glass travels with the narrative. Everything outside of it is not important.
The idea that seems to be lost on people, that once you hand over power to the government, right? In my small county, St. Louis County, it would have been unthinkable that the county executive could lock everyone in their houses. It would have been a thought that he wouldn't. It would have been preposterous. They would never have been elected had they said, "I have this power." But then when people got scared, they gave them that power. And now to wrench that away from their hands is nearly impossible. In fact, they're now codifying into law how much of that power they have and what you have to do, not to exert it, but actually to take it away. And this is happening on every single, whether it's the local level or up on the national level or even internationally, is that once you give that power to those governments, they never give it back.
Exactly. I mean, lockdown is now a legitimate policy. It's worked before, in the sense that it's worked for the government, that people have, they did not revolt in any significant capacity to actually take down the government. So yes, it works from their perspective. So expect, climate lockdowns, any sort of, maybe the seasonal
Oh
flu needs a
God,
lockdown.
climate lockdowns. Oh God, that
So
would be absurd.
it's now in the toolbox.
So let's talk a little bit about how you get outside of this narrative, because you have done something really extraordinary. I love checking in on your podcast because you somehow are going out into the edges of the internet, and you're finding those ideas that you're not allowed to talk about. you're framing them in a way that so far has not gotten you booted off of different channels. So let's first talk about, like, how did you get into doing the Subversive podcast, and where are these places that you hunt to find these very interesting characters?
Mostly on Twitter. I have to say, I got a little bit of clout on Twitter at one point because I just went on Twitter and started engaging with these spaces where people were speaking, interesting things. And I made some friends in these circles. And essentially that was kind of the first building block to this. Now I have guests from all over the place, but I would say still the bulk is people that I'm mutuals with on Twitter, or people that I know have something interesting to say. It's a bit of a kind of a demonic abyss as well, in the sense that it really does suck you in. But it's also a wonderful place where there's still quite a lot of freedom, especially for anonymous accounts, which for a lot of people are kind of burner accounts. If you respawn every time, and then you get a little bit more opsec and things like that, and then you essentially keep saying things until you respawn again, and things like that. So that's how it works. So that's mostly where I source my subversives. How did I not get booted off yet? I mean, beats me. I think a little ingredient is that I'm not in any I'm not, tied into any institutional place that, where I would be, a liability, so that people could, attack the institution rather than me. I live in semi-rural Romania, like in a city in Romania. It's not even like no one's ever heard of it. It's easier, I think, to say these things when you're at the fringes of the empire rather than, I don't know, tied into. I'm not really keen to get invited to any dinner parties. I have nothing to lose. I literally am nobody. So it's much easier. What are you gonna take from me? I mean, yeah, tell me my PayPal maybe, or things like that. Which it's quite possible and maybe even probable. Luckily, there's multiple platforms. Some cater to some nefarious people like me, but yeah, it's there's always a risk. But I think it's harder to get me with anything. There's and now I think there.
Yeah, people that haven't read 1984 recently forget that the majority of people in 1984 are free. They're just the people that are not a part of the inside party, or the the people trying to climb up that mountain. And I think back to my days when I was invited several times to go to different Clinton Global Initiative events, and you see these eager young people that would cut off their arm or give away their ability to have children or whatever to be able to climb up this mountain, and they are the ones that are oftentimes the most tied down. But there is a blast area. Just last week, we had on the podcast a guy named Sean Newman, and just the very act of interviewing a guy at the Canadian trucker convoy got him booted off of YouTube forever, permanently banned.
Oh, really? Yeah, I mean, things like that happen. I mean, I've had a few videos taken off, some very, very critical of COVID vaccines, actually, which I kind of understood. But it's interesting because I have the full length podcast on YouTube, and that wasn't taken off. It was just the specific video where I extracted the specific criticism of vaccines. So essentially, the content is still there, but I think they probably do some search in the text or in the show notes where if the title is vaccine related, I take it down automatically. So I think that's the worst that's happened to me. But I also think it's a question of positioning, like. I really don't cater to a left wing audience. I've always said, okay, I'm right wing. I'm a pariah. I'm not competing with you for any sort of social status in the kind of left wing or global hierarchy. I'm in my corner here in my hovel recording podcasts with nefarious people. You just leave us alone. I'll leave you alone. We don't need to interact, and it seems to work pretty well up until this point.
Early on in your podcast, I can remember when you did a podcast. I think it was with H.P. Lovecraft, and you digitized his voice so that way it couldn't be understood. You couldn't pick out what was his voice like, and figure out who he was. And I remember thinking, like, well, that seems like overkill. In fact, I think I even wrote you about it, like being like, oh, that's. But now, fast forward a year, and I think actually not that bad. And my opinion of doing anonymized things has really changed over time. I used to be full scale against anonymous quotes, anonymous attribution, but you begin to see why that happens, because if people want to have some normal part of a life, they maybe do need to have burner accounts and stay anonymous.
Yeah, I think these are people with a lot to lose. And there are also people who say things that maybe face posters, even like myself, would not be able to say, just because it's very risky. And sometimes as a podcaster who really wants to be sourcing from the spiciest pots, you have to have anonymous accounts on, and the voice modifier is necessary for a few of my guests. I mean, I'm actually another episode's coming up with a voice modifier, and I also think it adds to kind of the trust that people have in the podcast. Like I really have not had any issues with people security wise. I had lots of anonymous people on who had their normal voices on, not necessarily worried to have so-called voice docs where people might listen to a podcast and realize it's my neighbor. Or yeah, I don't know exactly how this happens, or I'm sure there's software to do this, and I'm being very technically naive, but yeah. So I think some people actually have a different public persona, so they might be speaking on other podcasts in a different capacity, or have a public facing role or something. One of the zero HP Lovecraft might be Elon Musk or something like that. That's kind of my weird feeling. Or Peter Thiel, though I don't think Peter's that concerned about his reputation. Yeah, so there's just definitely that, and I don't necessarily encourage it. I mean, I'm posting with my face as well, because I mean, it does help in terms of building a platform. People trust the fact that I'm here, I'm putting myself out there. It helps being a woman. I won't lie. I guess it's extra interesting, especially being speaking about things that people don't really address usually. Yeah, I mean, it is different. And I do even I tend to censor myself a little bit in terms of I'm not gonna go charging a machine gun nest if I can help it. If I know that, okay, if I say this is going to take me off and it's going to rob me of the opportunity to say maybe more I don't know, Straussian formulations of the same thing, a bit further down the line, which some people might understand, some people might not. So I don't know if this makes sense, but yeah, you kind of try to play it a little bit cool, even if you're in these waters.
Why do you think being a woman changes the way people interact with you?
It's just a different vibe. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm like some super attractive woman trying to it's just the fact that it's something I don't maybe more pleasant to look at. I'm not like a neckbeard guy in a basement somewhere. Not that you would be. You're also a very handsome man, obviously. I'm sure that helps you as well with reach for your podcast. These are things that people don't tend to talk about, but it really does help. To have a friendly, smiling, approachable face, or yeah.
I think that's why I like your podcast. I was listening to a couple over the weekend, and you say the things that everybody knows, but you're not really supposed to say, or you're not really supposed to bring up. And I think that one of the things that makes you unique, not just the fact that you're a woman in a space that doesn't have very many women, is you have a sort of detection mechanism for being able to figure out what is it that people aren't allowed to say? How can I say it in
It's
a way
called
that isn't going to
autism.
just
No, I'm kidding. I don't think I'm autistic, but there's something wrong with me. Don't worry.
So I think in your ability to spot those things you're not allowed to say and yet still say them in a way that doesn't alienate people, that probably gives you a view on larger culture. What do you think are changes to culture that are happening that most people, the normies, don't fully realize yet?
Well, I mean, I think maybe I'm being a bit hopeful here, because there's always the kind of echo chamber effect. I do think there is a bit of a preference cascade happening at the top. Um, like a lot of people in my sphere, I kind of subscribe to this elite theory, which is kind of the opposite of populism, where the world is essentially run by the preferences of small elites or very powerful minorities that kind of tend to sway public opinion, trends, and even in politics or things like that. And I think that it might have quite a lot of impact. Like I feel like a lot of people in the elite, like you were describing, there are a lot of people who'd cut off a hand to go to like a whatever globalist meeting, Clinton Foundation soiree or something like that. That I feel like that attraction to those spaces is waning, and there's an attraction to other spaces that is waxing, just because the lies and the amount of untruth that has built up in the kind of old elite structure, like the number of untruths that you need to ascribe to become one of the elite at this moment is immense. Which on the one hand helps you as an elite because it's such a baroque structure that only someone with a lot of free time and a lot of fancy education can learn. That helps in one way, but on the other end, if you're like someone who's actually intelligent and curious about the world and interested in things that might be a little bit countercultural, you're not necessarily going to want to go that direction. So you might be more interested in other meme plexes or directions. So I think we're probably at a bit of an inflection point. There's a lot of interesting things happening. I mean, hopefully my podcast is one of those interesting things. And I see a lot more, young people coming over to me. I mean, I've actually been to a conference where I spoke recently, which is kind of strange and surreal to one, be invited, and two, have like lots of younger people, like early 20s, up to 30s, come to me and say, oh, I love your podcast. I even signed autographs. Like, that's insane. And it's, yeah, mostly the young people. The older people have never heard of me. They think I'm some, who's this woman, who invited her? But it's, yeah, it's heartening to see. And a lot of people who are like in student organizations or some, strivers in some capacity. They're ambitious people, but they're not the people who would rather go to the soirees at the Clinton household. So yeah, that's kind of hopeful for me. I mean, other trends. My friend, default friend, she was highlighting the fact that we're going to have a huge backlash to sex positivity. Like we're about to see a lot of more books written, movies, a lot more culture cachet for people who are more prudish, rather than this whole sex work is work. Women have the same desires as men. You need to check things off your sex bucket list, cosmopolitan style. Yeah, pursuit of the opposite sex. Yeah, I think that's a big trend. I don't know, more normalization of things that are now kind of edgy on the internet, as they tend to be. They're going to slide into mainstream culture, and they're going to take different other forms while they're being kind of co-opted into existing narratives. So yeah, it's an interesting time to be on the internet.
Yeah, I can remember when Trump was running for the first election, and this is when Milo Yiannopoulos kind of hit the scene, and this was just absolutely insane. And I remember watching him be hoisted on the shoulders of a bunch of frat guys, carrying a gay man dressed and very flamboyantly onto the stage, and me thinking, okay, culture is definitely changing, and I think it did. But then COVID had this kind of like pullback effect that is hard to describe. I was just talking with a teacher the other day who said one of the things he didn't expect would happen during COVID is when they came back to school, there was a percentage of students, about 10%, that became the strongest enforcers of people wearing masks. He's like, it wasn't very long before I got reported because I wasn't wearing my mask when doing some lessons. And all of a sudden you had kids going and reporting on me, which like, woo, that sent a chill down my spine. So I, on one hand, I'm hopeful that there's like a kickback to this kind of pendulum swing, but I also have been around long enough to know that the last time I thought it was coming, it didn't come.
Yeah, and I think probably the biggest meta trend here is that there's going to be further fracturing in these kind of mimetic tribes, like the fact that the internet lets you self-select what type of culture you want to receive, and it kind of lets you sort yourself into different groups by temperament, by taste, by whatever, by whoever's influencing you. And you can see that, I guess, in this class. You had the 10% of kids who were extremely scared of COVID, might have something to do with their household. Maybe their parents were very frightened of the virus, or whoever. Maybe they're consuming some sort of scare media in on social media or something like that. Maybe an influencer was very into COVID. You never know exactly what it was. And then you have this kind of very intransigent minority in the classroom, and they tend to impose their values up on the other people, because yeah, they're intransigent. And especially when it comes to hygiene norms, people tend to be easy to they fold easily with these things, because you don't want to be seen as a disease vector or dirty, or something like that. So it's much easier to defer to the highest standard in hygiene, because you don't want to be seen like the guy who picks his nose, or is some sort of a pariah because of that. So these things tend to cascade much faster than other things. So yeah, I can see that, because there's going to be a lot of fracturing. You're going to see more of these intransigent minorities in different groups imposing like very strong values up on the other kids. And you probably can see this with trans identity as well. Like there's huge social contagion in these things, especially with teenage girls and things like that. Small intransigent minority completely believes in whatever transgender ideas were coming piping in hot for the internet. And then they become, kind of the core promoters of this ideology. And then obviously the other girls tend to, yeah, gravitate towards it because it's very strong. Like a lot of these meme plexes are very morally very strong. They make huge moral claims about the nature of reality, about what men and women are, things like that. They're very fascinating. They're meaning giving, transcending your gender. That's what a project. What a fascinating thing to do, especially for like maybe a slightly anxious or depressed or unsure teenage girl. That's a great thing to be doing with your friends. Maybe why not? There's a collective dimension to it too. So um, there's going to be a lot of these strange, or strange, maybe not strange for people who see this from the outside, but a lot of social contagion, a lot of these phenomena that kind of originate on the internet and then propagate like wildfire in the world.
Yeah, my buddy was talking about this issue in school, about how he's like, basically there's a different flavor whatever school you go to, the whatever the transgender challenge that's going on. In his school, he was saying they were non-binary students and it was a group of girls, and he described it as the mean girls now had a victim card that they could play, and that they were playing it against really some of the most vulnerable of the young heterosexual boys that were like, he'd be like, they're seventh grade boys, but they're the shy ones. They're the ones that don't want to play dodgeball. And now these kids are being targeted by these mean girls. And he's like, it's bullying on a scale that's really hard to push back on, because as a teacher, if I step in, now I'm violating victims that are just trying to, help other people understand the way around the world. And he was like, and this herein lies a big challenge, because then you as the teacher are worried about, am I going to have the finger pointed at me for breaking some norm or mistreating some victim, and how quickly that can cascade out of control. And I was thinking, like, wow, how do you ever get out of this cycle unless culture itself goes out of that cycle?
Yeah, and I think this is a big problem that I have with people who are nominally right wing or nominally conservative. Like we end up having to haggle over peanuts. Like when should girls get mastectomies? Should it be 16 or 18? Should they be of age when they start hormone treatment? Is there can children block puberty and things like that? Very few people are right wing enough to say no, we're not having any of these. Women are women, men are men. This sounds absolutely insane. You're a denier of whatever, but this has completely like just completely railroaded everyone, because it's like, okay, they've pushed it to 90%, and now we're haggling over the last 10%. Like, this is a philosophical question about the nature of man, and they're acting like it's settled. Yeah, of course, men can transcend their sex. If they put on a wig and some nice makeup, yeah, obviously they somehow their essence transforms into a woman. This sounds very spicy to most people now, that it's like, okay, are you I don't know, denying trans lives or something like that? There's all sorts of very heavy emotional language tied to resistance towards this, very philosophical debate. And my response is, I mean, we haven't even had this debate. It's all about, who gets the hormones, who gets to, when should they be transing, um it's insane. Like, yeah.
Yeah, you've already jumped past where the philosophical argument is, and now you're talking about the specifics.
Exactly. I mean,
And you know,
thank you, marketplace of ideas. Like, what type of marketplace is this where it's literally just us haggling over details of your ideas?
and people forget that gender itself, like in every major religious text, this is one of the very, very first things that people address. And now you could come and say, hey, as a modern society, we should be checking on these things that we were just handed, right? Received wisdom may not be the right answer, but it's not like people treat it as though we've just discovered some like magical knowledge that nobody else had for thousands and thousands of years, or even if they did, they were shoehorned or pressed or oppressed into keeping these narratives that aren't true, and we can just throw them off. And certainly, any kind of culture change that's as fundamental as messing with the first few lines of the Bible are major culture changes.
Especially if it's, supposed to go under the radar. We shouldn't even talk about the fact that it's messing with the first few lines of the Bible. And, the fact that most conservatives, maybe not most conservatives, but most conservatives in the spotlight, people who are like maybe in the GOP and who are angling to get to certain dinner parties, they're essentially, people who are still kind of within the liberal frame, and they're talking to the same people. They're maybe in Washington, they're going to dinner with the same group of people, and they kind of want to be, maybe 2 clicks more conservative than whatever's on the table now. And that's not conservatism. I mean, if you're just conserving the liberalism from 2 weeks ago, no thank you, I really don't want to be a conservative then. And that's why, people like me call themselves right wing, because conservatism, this is not. This is, tabula rasa. We don't want the liberalism from 10 years ago. It really doesn't help us. So I think, that's kind of interesting. That's what's also interesting about the people that I have on my show. Like, I think that's kind of an implicit assumption. Like, these are not GOP talking points. We're not talking about who's getting hormones at what age. We try to get to, the root philosophical issues about principles, values, what is a good regime, what is good leadership, what is, is authority legitimate, things like that, which, are questions that supposedly have been settled a very long time ago, maybe by the founders of the United States, or, even antiquity. But many people don't think about them at all. Like, what is freedom, what is liberalism? This is the system that we have. We've been living in it for, since before we were born. And most people don't understand what exactly, it is, how it functions, checks and balances, which ones, who rules. Actually, that's a good question. Like, who is in charge? So yeah, that's kind of.
And most of the things, the fundamental issues that you're describing are were settled so long ago that we don't even have parents or grandparents that experience the world without these things. So, I talk about the freedom of speech thing, right? Like, people know what it's like to have some of your speech curtailed, but not like what they had in the 16th century, where you literally were not allowed to blaspheme against God. Otherwise, they could literally kill you, or they could is confine you to a prison on a ship for years and years and years just for doing minor infractions. But like, it's been gone so long that we assume, just like somebody that's saying, oh, are we right on the cusp of getting rid of war? Like, have we become so modern that we no longer need this like old affectation of the way people settled problems? And it's like, these things were put in there because things were so bad that they had to eventually come together and everybody be like, hey, we really do mean you should be able to bear arms. We really do mean you should protect free speech at all costs. But if you don't even know anybody that knows anybody that experienced the world without it, it's very difficult to wrap your mind fully around it.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a certain level of comfort that people have grown accustomed to. Like, this whole concept of, it's the end of history, and what does that entail? Is it the end of war? Is it the end of disease? Is it the end of I don't know, whatever. Even the whole conversation about inequality. Is it the end of need? Is it the end of billionaires? It's uncomfortable for me that the fact that there's this Jeff Bezos is out there on his yacht. It just kills me inside, and I'd really like him to not be there. And I'd like a more equitable society, even if most people have food, shelter, whatever, the very basics of life. The idea that there's huge inequality is jarring to me. Maybe that's a reasonable request, but what exactly is the stuff of life? That's is a world without war even imaginable? Is a world without disease? I mean, is a world without death? Because death is on the table now as well. It's there's a lot of conversations in terms of transhumanism. There's longevity research. Do we even have to die? Cryonics. You can just put yourself in a vat and maybe get frozen for 500 years and then reanimated when medicine is at a future state, and all your problems will be solved. There's a lot of conversation uploading yourself into the cloud or whatever substrate. That's also a conversation. So I think there's kind of this perception. I tie it to the kind of the liberal metaphor of what it is to be a human. This individual that's somewhere behind the eyes, making decisions in a rational way, taking in information, deciding for himself. And then obviously, if you're just kind of like a this ethereal thing behind your eyes. Your body is a meat suit. You can exchange it. You can be a man or a woman. It makes sense. You can upload yourself to whatever, because you're essentially just an essence that's wearing this body. So this whole metaphor lets you think in that way. Lets you decide that, okay, if my body's not necessarily, why can't we just hack the world? You can hack politics. There might be there has to be an algorithm for politics to just solve politics. You should solve war. Why should we have war? Why should we have need? Why should we have inequality? Why should we have these things that have been with us since the dawn of time and are part and parcel of what it is to be human in a collective? Why should you have parents? There's surrogacy. You could just go to Ukraine and maybe get a child from someone, or there's different ways of negotiating this. So there are essentially this metaphor kind of spawns this perspective that we're just one step away from solving everything for ourselves, and on every level.
Yeah, and we better get the philosophical part of it down before we actually do the physical challenge of living forever or getting rid of war. The big cultural change that I think has snuck up on people and is very difficult to talk about is you know we've dealt with a concept called bare branch theory for a long time. This is when there are many men, more men than there are women, and they can't get married, so they're out of the gene pool. And we know that if that balance swings too wildly out of control, you have things like banditry, people joining giant mobs, wars happen. This has happened all over the Middle East, Asia. This is something that you can actually fairly clearly chart what happens. But we haven't had the situation that we have right now in the United States. More than 50% of women over the age of 35 don't have children. This is such a categorical change to culture that nobody is talking about. But you think about the change that is to culture. You now have women that have presumably a lot more resources because they're not spending them on children. They've been able to stay in the workforce. Whatever their political leanings are, that they have more time and energy to be able to put towards those things. Where do you think this goes in a culture where more than 50% of the women don't have children?
I mean, it's a clear extinction path. It simply is. There's I mean, children, the way they're perceived right now by the rational individual behind the eyes driving the meat suit. They're a cost center. They're a place where, you if they're kind of almost like a consumption luxury. If you can afford one, and if you're really so inclined, you might have one, or you might get one through whatever means. So it's um it's it's not necessarily part of the natural life path. It's very much an option, and it is an expensive option. Like if you want, the full option child with the, good schools and the nice clothes and, whatever accessories you want to purchase for the child, and especially also, to fit in with the other children who also have good schools and nice clothes and whatever accessories they have. You really have to, I don't know, what was it, $250,000 or something. Better be prepared to pay up. Probably less in Romania, but depends what social circles you're angling to get into. It's I can understand why people are not keen to jump on that. They in let's say in medieval times, people used to have as many children as God gave them. There wasn't really, there are probably ideas, more primitive ideas about contraception. There are ways to not have children, but now essentially contraception is on demand. Abortion is on demand in most places. Very much everything's very family planning oriented. Marriage is not the purpose of life. And children don't help around the house. They're not adding to the household. They're not needed. They're definitely not needed. They need you. You don't need them. You don't need them for alliances with other families. You don't need them to pass on property. They get their own property. Isn't that what boomer parents told us? Make your own money. They're essentially just, for a lot of people who live the rational individual lifestyle, where the point is to find yourself, be authentic, and accumulate experiences, and then you die. There really is no point to having children. They're essentially a financial burden, and they might give you some happiness, but there's no transcendent value in having children if you don't believe in something transcendent, which I think a lot of people are gravitating towards more maybe classical, religious teachings and more traditional forms of life, because especially if you go through the motions with being the rational individual, if you go, have the experiences, if you have the career, at one point you really do realize that, what exactly, maybe you play out your life, how many promotions, how many Nepalese restaurants can I put under my belt until I feel like, I've had the experiences, bungee jumping, or what is it that should be the thing that makes my life complete. Um, and then you realize, yeah, no, there's quite a lot of anxiety in that, in that, what's it called, the hedonic treadmill. You run and run faster and faster, and there really isn't anything at the end of it. You're just more exhausted every day. So yeah, I think that's, I'm rambling, but yeah, I think that's my point, maybe.
Well, I think I it was a very interesting thing in your Blake Masters interview. So he's running for U.S. Senate out of Arizona, but you guys had a very candid conversation. If he becomes a senator, that was either way, it was a great inverse in conversation between you and him. But if he becomes a senator, that will be a very interesting mark along his history. And one of the things that you guys were talking about was consumerism on the left has really been considered a faux pas. You don't want to be a consumer. Is that you're not making money so that way you can accumulate goods or houses or products, but instead it is this concept that you should be out there pursuing experiences and trying to travel and soak in all this world. I had never really thought about it, but that was a sort of clever sleight of hand that happened in the accumulation of wealth, and you should give over your youth to working professionally and having these experiences. That was very insightful.
Yeah, and in a sad way, like the second you commoditize something, it really robs it of a lot of its essence, doesn't it? Like, you know, if you look at like the travels of like a, naturalist in the 1800s, like, I don't know, Alexander von Humboldt, and adventures on the high sea, and meeting exotic people, that's a completely different type of travel, and I can see the romanticism and everything in that. jumping on like a low cost airline to be like the 5 millionth person to go to Barcelona this month, and eating at, the same chain restaurants and the same things, and waiting in line for 2 hours to see this beautiful house by Gaudi, but it's there's another 1,000 people in there with you. It's just a completely different type of experience. And though they're both called travel, and they're both supposed to be culturally enriching, you're essentially just doing essentially the same things that you do in a different metropolis of the world, because they all seem to kind of converge in what they look like and what they feed you and what the vibe is. And it's is it actually enriching? What exactly are you participating in? So there's that layer to it. Like the experiences themselves have turned into products. There's what's that called, reduced marginal return after a certain point with any sort of thing like this. And I feel like for most categories we've reached that point. Like there's how much more enjoyment are you going to get from that? And even enjoyment in itself, is that the point of life? That's the question.
Yeah, I mean, as a person, like I did a ton of traveling and I lived all over the world. I was in the Peace Corps. I worked as a deckhand on a ship. And I was just telling my wife, to your point, the diminishing marginal returns of continuing to travel relative to spending an afternoon teaching my daughter the names of the flowers outside is just not comparable. But it's one of those things that had somebody tried to tell me this when I was younger, there's no possible way I could have understood it. And there's something in our culture that I think used to be transmitted by the fact that you didn't have kids in daycare, right? It was families taking care of kids, and you were around it a lot more. But a lot of people are not around kids, and they're not in a community. And if you are going to have kids, you do have to participate in this larger kind of weird economic system of daycares and how to get to work. And I mean, in order for any of this to change, there would have to be such profound changes to culture that I think it could only come at the end of a crisis, at the end
Yeah.
of that no one would choose to do. You would only do it if you had to.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the sad truth at the bottom of all of this, is that the families splitting apart, the fact that there are no more intergenerational families, and you can't really rely on your grandparents to take care of your kids, and your brothers live maybe countries away, and things like that. These are all outgrowths of a certain type of prosperity. Like we really don't need our family. Way back in the day, we lived in intergenerational families because there was one house, and that was a house where everyone lived. And you would do you would cook together, and people would take care of each other, because there was a need. Now we have enough prosperity to each have each our own houses, and we have enough prosperity to hire a Hungarian slash Honduran, depending on your location, nanny to help with the children. I mean, if not, there's always the state stepping in. There are state sponsored daycares. If the market can't handle it, there's a state. But it's not family anymore. Everyone's minding their own business, because that's essentially kind of what liberal market economy and everything has permitted us to do. It is also our revealed preference. This is what people tend to want to do, because you could move in with your grandparents, you could move in with your family. People tend to not want to do that, because there's tensions, there's friction when you live with other people. It's much easier. That's why you see, even with applications, like people don't even want to call you on the phone anymore. It's all very frictionless. You can just click a button and someone shows up at your door silently, takes you to the airport, doesn't even talk to you. Your no hands delivery on your Uber Eats or whatever. It's all just things appear and you get teleported from here to there. You don't even have to interact. iPads in the restaurant. That's the future. People feel awkward. They don't want to go through the hard part of actually engaging with people. And it is kind of a sad reality of how humans are constructed. But the problem is, humans don't know what's good for them. Unfortunately, if you deny yourself the opportunity to have social friction, to engage with people, you're missing out on something that is essential to what it means to be human. It might be comfortable, it's like not going to the gym in a way, like you don't go to the gym or you don't do workout at all for a year. It's very comfortable. You're not doing anything hard. It's awesome. But then you barely move, and maybe they'll have to get you out of your house with a crane eventually, because you're not you're not doing the things that are essential to being human. And there's many of these things that we just kind of lost out on because of just simple comforts that the market economy has allowed us.
So this can get pretty nihilistic pretty quickly or pretty dark. What is something that has given you the experience of joy in the last little while?
Oh, my my son. Yeah, absolutely. My son, my husband, working in the garden, I don't know, preparing food for the family, writing something, even like just meeting the people at that conference that I spoke at. It was really, really lovely, going to dinner, meeting with people, everything that I've done that was social. And my baby's christening was a wonderful day. Yeah, just hanging out outside, all of these things, very much basic, nothing very meta, nothing very political, but yeah, it's been definitely highlights of the last few months or years.
And my favorite question that you ask on Subversive, which I'll ask you right now, what is an undervalued author or thinker or somebody that everybody should be paying attention to, but probably don't know about?
Man, I should probably think about this question more. Yeah, it's let me think about what I've read recently. Actually, yeah, yeah, this has been a recommendation
Could
from
even
a
be one of
friend.
your podcast guests. You've had a lot. I
Oh
mean, there's
yeah,
the
yeah.
undervalued podcast guests.
I mean, undervalued podcast guests. They're all wonderful. My podcast guests. I can't pick favorites, but I have a thinker that I think is really interesting. I've been just kind of researching it because thinking of writing a book. It's going to take forever. Not coming out anytime soon, but it's kind of semi in the works. And I'm doing research for the book, and it's a ecologist called Pentti Linkola, and that's kind of what I'm reading now. And he is sometimes accused of being an eco-fascist. He's got some crazy ideas, but I think his core vision of the world. The idea that he has this concept of the mind of nature is driven by need, and the mind of the humans is driven by desire. And kind of nature is a very there's no excess in nature. Everything, if there's enough water and source of hydrocarbons, and mold will spring out and moss and everything, and there's no excess. Humans, we have an unquenchable need, and we tend to have desires that are just very different from needs. We don't console ourselves with the bare minimum, which is kind of the way in nature, and that kind of has a lot of consequences for ecology. Obviously, this is his main concern, but also it kind of has its own philosophy built in. So this is kind of the space I'm exploring, and yeah, I think he's an interesting person to look at. There's an audiobook actually. And the book is called "Will Life Prevail?" which is just a collection of essays. I don't think there's actually a conclusion. Man is pretty hardcore on the apocalyptic visions of ecology. I don't necessarily put that much weight on that, but his philosophy and his perspective, and being he was a fisherman for I think 35 years in the Finnish fjords, like very very living in kind of like a Unabomber style hut. Men talk the talk and walk the walk, and he's a very fascinating character. I think people should check him out.
Well, that's an unexpected recommendation. So, for people that want to find out more about the Subversive podcast or follow you, where would they do that?
Yeah, for now, I am still on Twitter at Kaschuta. That's my last name. I have everything in my bio. And if you want to check out the podcast, I mean, we're on Patreon. Essentially, the Patreon just gives you advanced access to the episodes. Most episodes come out in full everywhere. It just takes a bit of time. And if you type in the Subversive Podcasts with Kaschuta, then all the links will be on the internet.
Well, Alex Kaschuta, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Vance.